Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I'm back with some more esoterica. Today we're diving back into the works of Carl Jung. This is Mysterium Conjunctionis. We are reading aloud and discussing as we go along the various points that are brought to light by the text. It is not the format for everyone, but people do find value in it, so you are more than welcome to tag along as we continue our exploration. Before we begin, however, if you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time I lose you in terminology, there will be several playlists linked in the corner above, in the box down below, along with the original source material, the link for my book, and the links to get in contact with me directly so that you can get a better understanding of who I am and why I say the things that I do. With that being said, we are going to dive in and continue our exploration of the Mysterium Conjunctionis with Chapter 4, Part 8, The Religious Problem of the King's Renewal, and this one will probably be meaty. Medical psychology has recognized today that it is a therapeutic necessity. Indeed, the first requisite of any thorough psychological method for consciousness to confront its shadow. I am in complete agreement with that. That is one of the things that I so very highly recommend. Footnote 396. In Freud, this is done by making conscious the repressed contents, but in Adler, by gaining insight into the fictitious lifestyle. In the end, this must lead to some kind of union, even though this union consisted first in an open conflict and often remained so for a long time. It is a struggle that cannot be abolished by rational means. I disagree with that heartily. 397. This sentence needs qualifying as it does not apply to all conflict situations. Anything that can be decided by reason without injurious effects can be safely left to reason. I am thinking rather of those conflicts which reason can no longer master without danger to the psyche. There is no part of your internal reflection that you should not be able to get to by a rational approach. That is not to say that there will not be distress involved in it. Right? Going back and doing the shadow work to integrate your shadow into who you are, which is what this is talking about, is an intrinsic part of the enlightenment process. It is painful in some places. I cannot give you a one-for-one account of what it will be like for you, but for me, I had to go through a lot of abuse, right? I grew up in abuse. Coming out of that, coming to the understandings around that was sometimes difficult. It is something, however, upon reflection, you can come to. And so I don't think that there's any part of it that is outside of the rational means. That does not mean that you will not have to pass through the irrational parts to get to the rational means. And so I am in agreement with this, but I don't believe that it is expressed quite correctly. When it is willfully repressed, it continues in the unconscious and merely expresses itself indirectly and all the more dangerously, so no advantage is gained. The struggle goes on until the opponents run out of breath. What the outcome will be can never be seen in advance. The only certain thing is that both parties will be changed. By what the product of the union will be, it is impossible to imagine. The empirical material shows that it usually takes the form of a subjective experience, which, according to the unanimous testimony of history, is always of a religious order. That is true through history, right? The product of the union will be impossible to imagine. Now, you cannot imagine the ending when you begin. The transformation is pretty complete. The understandings that you will achieve are something that you cannot conceive of until you are going through the understandings, right? Agreement. The usually takes the form of a subjective experience. True, that is subjective to you, right? You are doing it, so it is naturally subjective, as opposed to objective as something that is repeatable by other people, right? It has to be subjective, which, according to the unanimous testimony of history, is always of a religious order. That is true if you take the caveat of it doesn't have to be inside of an existing control system, right? We use the control systems to do that but it is not as effective as not using the control systems. And by control systems, I mean religious organizations, whether that be Catholicism, any of the various forms of Protestantism, Islam, Buddhism, any of the religious orders. There is, inside of the religion, a tendency to try to organize in such a way that this would be the outflow. But that is not intrinsic to the religion. It just simply happens, right? It's kind of the point, but it is not the overt point, right? And so it does not have to be in a religious order, but it is going to be a religious experience, almost certainly, right? There may be somebody that can get to this point without the divine, right? I cannot rule that out, but it is highly unlikely. Right? I don't believe that it is possible. I don't. It may be. I don't like to use the exclusives, right? I don't like to say all or every. And so I can say that every experience will naturally lead into the divine, but I do believe so, right? I do. And so it doesn't have to be an existing religious order, but it will almost certainly be a religious experience. If, therefore, the conflict is consciously endured and the analyst follows its course without prejudice, he will unfailingly observe compensations from the unconscious which aim at producing a unity. He will come across numerous symbols similar to those found in alchemy, often, indeed, the very same. He will also discover that not a few of these spontaneous formations have a numinous quality in harmony with the mysticism of the historical testimonies. It may happen, besides, that a patient, who till then had shut his eyes to religious questions, will develop an unexpected interest in these matters. He may, for instance, find himself getting converted from modern paganism to Christianity, or from one creed to another, or even getting involved in the fundamental theological questions which are incomprehensible to a layman. It is unnecessary for me to point out here that not every analysis leads to a conscious realization of the conflict, just as not every surgical operation is as drastic as a resection of the stomach. There is a minor surgery too, and in the same way there is a minor psychotherapy whose operations are harmless and require no such elucidation as I am concerned with here. Right? I'm not interested at all in the minor psychotherapy. Right? If it is harmless, it's doing you no good. Right? I tell you quite often, right? Therapy is a wonderful thing. If you are going to the correct therapist and you are doing talk therapy and working through your shadow, that is good. That is 100% a good thing. But if you are going to a therapist and all you are redoing is rehashing the exact same things and not literally working through them, but simply stating them over and over and over again, that does you no good. That is completely worthless. All you are doing is wasting your money. If you go to a therapist and all they want to do is prescribe you some drugs because you don't feel right, they are not doing you any good. Those drugs serve a purpose. Maybe. And the science is definitely leading away from that. But it is possible that these antidepressants can help you balance yourself chemically to the point where you can balance yourself mentally. Right? It allows you to get to the point where you can. If you are taking these psychotropic drugs for longer than a year or two on the outside, your therapist is doing you a disservice. If you are not working through your shadow and coming out of it hurt, crying, angry, happy, elated, right? If you're not feeling extreme emotions coming out of therapy, you don't need to go. If you are not working through solid issues, talking about things that are improving your life, you don't need to go. And so if you are going just to talk, don't go. Talk to your friends. It's just as effective. The therapist is harming you. They are allowing you to think that you are doing something that you are not. If you are just going and rehashing, you are not working through your issues. And so for me, that is this harmless psychotherapy. And that is completely useless. That is probably 90% of the psychotherapists out there today. there is probably 10% of them that can actually work with you on your shadow in a way that is going to be effective. And like, that's not taking into account my spiritual side of things. That is entirely the secular part of it. There's only about 10% of them that are probably doing any good whatsoever. Most of them are Freudians. That is intrinsically flawed. Most of them are there for a paycheck. They believe even that they are helping, but they are not. Hopefully, I have been clear about that, right? Both here and everywhere else that we have discussed it. Therapy is wonderful. It is one of the life-saving things. And before therapy, you went and talked to the priest. Before the priest, you went and talked to the shaman or the elder or whoever it happened to be. You went and discussed these things, but it was not an ongoing situation. Ever. Back to the text. The patients I have in mind are a small minority with certain spiritual demands to be satisfied, and only these patients undergo a development which presents the doctor with the kind of problems we are about to discuss. Experience shows that the union of antagonistic elements is an irrational occurrence which can be fairly described as mystical, provided that one means by this an occurrence that cannot be reduced to anything else, or regarded in some way as unauthentic. The decisive criterion here is not rationalistic opinions or regard for accepted theories, but simply and solely the value for the patient of the solution he has found and experienced. In this respect, the doctor, whose primary concern is the preservation of life, is in an advantageous position, since he is by training an empiricist and has always had to employ medicines whose healing power he knew, even though he did not understand how it worked. Equally, he finds all too often that the scientifically explained and attested healing power of his medicines does not work in practice. Didn't I just talk about how the science is currently leading away from these emotional suppressors, right? All of these drugs that we have been taking for the last 30 years to correct our mood, it is being found that they do nothing in the long term to help you. And that is not me, right? That is multiple studies that are coming out currently. If, now, the alchemists meant by their old king that he was God himself, this also applies to his son. They themselves must have shrunk from thinking out the logical consequences of their symbolism. Otherwise, they would have to assert that God grows old and must be renewed through the arts. No. Right? That is an anthropomorphication. That is casting upon the divine the attributes of the mortal. And while that may be a correlation, it is not necessarily a thing. It is not intrinsic to the understanding. We have that because of our vanity. And so there is, all right, otherwise they would have to assert, right, that God grows old. No. Your understanding of God can grow old and evolve. If you don't believe that, Judaism evolved from other understandings, other religious systems. They took pretty much wholesale and changed some of the names and some of the occurrences, maybe the timing, but it was all existent somewhere else. And they evolved from those other systems into this system that they had. And then Christianity did the same thing with Judaism. It evolved completely from this old system into a new one, holding on and clinging to some things that were not necessarily good, right? That is the system getting old and needing renewal, right? Through the art even, right? Through a better understanding, we can come to a better understanding. That is the evolution of the concept of God, not God himself. God, and even me using himself, is anthropomorphizing it past the point where it is acceptable. I only use that vernacular because everybody else does, right? If everybody else called it a she, I would call it a she. It is neither he nor she. It contains both in equal measure. not necessarily hermaphroditic, not necessarily incorporated in a physical body, not necessarily resembling us in the slightest. That is something that we have assumed. People wrote it in a book because they assumed it, not because they were told it. Such a thought would have been possible at most in the Alexandrian epoch when gods sprang up like mushrooms, but for medieval man, it was barely conceivable. 398. There were, nevertheless, some who would have liked to have the Holy Ghost as a familiar during their work. You do, right? Not in a physical corporeal form. If there is a physical corporeal form, it's not the spirit. But the spirit is what I talk about in here, and it is the thing that carries out the commands. And so therefore it is very much a familiar, right? That was what a familiar was. It was the thing that allowed you to do the magic. That is the spirit. As long as you're not anthropomorphizing it, as long as you are not creating a physical entity for it, or even thinking that you have a full understanding of it, right? I have an understanding. I don't claim that it is the only one. I stand on it firmly because it is mine, right? It is the one that has been revealed to me and has been effective in my life. You might have the exact opposite conception and it work equally well. I don't know, right? I stand upon what I know. But I don't think that I have a full and complete understanding of the entirety of the Holy Spirit. I just have a conjecture on how I think it works. And so that is the video that is linked up at the top, right? The Divine and the Trinity Explained. I do believe that it is real. I do believe the things that I have written, the things that I talk about, but I am willing to be corrected because nobody knows. Everybody guesses. Even logical guesses are still guesses. He was far more likely to consider that the art would change something in himself, for which reason he regarded its product as a kind of apocryph. Had he had any idea of psychology, he would almost certainly have called his healing medicament psychic, and would have regarded the king's renewal as a transformation of the conscious dominant, which naturally has nothing to do with a magical intervention in the sphere of the gods. You are the conscious dominant that is making the decisions. You are the king that is renewed. You are the thing that is new. Right? Without magical intervention. You can do magic. I firmly and fully stand upon that. I have healed myself in 4 different ways. You can do magic. And it is through the Spirit, which is the understanding, in my understanding, it is the representative of God in the finite, right? The Spirit is everything in existence. The Logos is that Spirit changing. They are inseparable from each other. That is not intervention of the gods. That is you using the power that God has given you for creation, from creation to creation. That is not magical intervention. That is magical intention. And I fully believe that magical intention is part of the integration. That the coming to the understanding of the magical part of this leads naturally into the religious part of this, and that is intrinsic to the psychic part of this. Man's ideas and definitions of God have followed one another kaleidoscopically in the course of the millennia, and the evangelist Mark would have been very much astonished if he could have taken a look at Harnack's History of Dogma. And yet it is not a matter of indifference which definitions of his conscious dominant man considers to be binding, or what sorts of views he happens to have in this regard. For on this depends whether consciousness will be king or not. If the unconscious rules to the exclusion of all else, everything is liable to end in destruction, as the present state of things gives us reason to fear. He keeps referring to the present state of things. It is important to remember that this was the late 1920s, and there was definitely some things which should have given reason to fear. Right? We were coming into World War II, and all of the atrocities that were unfolding, for him, that was real time. We talked in the last video about the pen, right? This represents the coin of consciousness on one side and unconsciousness on the other side. For the most part, your consciousness only consumes a small part of your life if you are not intentionally working towards being more conscious. Most of your things come from the unconscious part of your psyche. But the conscious part, that is the ego, that is you making decisions, that is the piece, in my estimation, that God has portioned out for you for this 5D navigation device that is the temple of God. The Spirit allows all of the things to happen, making the Trinity body, mind, and soul, or body, soul, and spirit. Right? That is the Trinity. You, as the conscious ego, make decisions. Most of your decisions are made by the unconscious, however. This process that we talk about moves this slider down towards the unconscious end. You make more and better conscious decisions the more that you become enlightened as to the way that things actually exist. And so this is quite literally choosing to be the conscious king. What he is talking about here, right? If you allow the unconscious to make your decisions for you, then it will end up in destruction, almost certainly. And so I'm not in disagreement. I just wanted to hit the allegory of the pen one more time, because it may come up again. If the dominant is too weak, life is wasted in fruitless conflict because Soul and Luna will not unite. But if the Sun is dominant, then Soul is his right eye and Luna his left. The dominant must contain them both, the standpoint of ego consciousness and the standpoint of the archetypes in the unconscious. The binding force that inevitably attaches to a dominant should not mean a prison for one and a carte blanche for the other, but duty and justice for both. That is absolutely true. The farther along this process that you get, the less that it is arbitrary, the more that it is intentional, and that intentionality is centered around these two concepts: duty and justice. What the nature is of that unity which, in some incomprehensible way, embraces the antagonistic elements, eludes our human judgment, for the simple reason that nobody can say what a being is like that unites the full range of consciousness with that of the unconscious. Man knows no more than his consciousness and knows himself only so far as this extends. Beyond that lies an unconscious sphere with no assignable limits, and it too belongs to the phenomenon, man. We might therefore say that perhaps the one is like a man, that is, determined and determinable, and yet undetermined and indeterminable. That is trying to stretch an allegory, right? Yes, okay, fine. But, yeah, okay, whatever. Always, one ends up with paradoxes when knowledge reaches its limits. The ego knows it is part of this being, but only a part. The symbolic phenomenology of the unconscious makes it clear that although consciousness is accorded this status of spiritual kingship, with all its attendant dangers, we cannot say what kind of king it will be. This depends upon two factors: on the decision of the ego and the assent of the unconscious. I don't know about that, right? I don't know that the unconscious assents to. I believe that the consciousness makes the decision and forces it upon the unconscious if you are doing it correctly. You're not necessarily getting permission from the unconscious. Any dominant that does not have the approval of the one or the other proves to be unstable in the long run. I disagree with that. I do, right? The unconscious is the tendency towards the negative. If you are making the conscious, that is improving the tendency towards the positive. For me, the reliance upon the submittal of the unconscious is not going to work. The unconscious will take part. You recognize the unconscious, you recognize the tendencies and the urges, but you don't give in to them. You don't ask them for permission to dismiss them. If you are feeling anger and it is not righteous anger justified for righteous action, then it is your duty to suppress that unconscious act. It is not your duty to ask your unconscious, is it okay if I release this anger? Or is it okay if I release this jealousy? That is not okay, right? Your unconscious is going to tell you no. You have to consciously decide, I no longer want these things, and assert that upon the unconscious. If you don't give it a choice, that is fighting, right? Like I tell you all of the time, you can't fight addiction. I mean, fighting addiction is giving it the capacity to win. You have to defeat addiction. You defeat addiction by inserting your will upon it, not by asking it if it is okay if you remove it from your life. We know how often in the course of history consciousness has subjected its highest and most central ideas to drastic revision and correction. But we know little or nothing about the archetypal processes of change which, we may suppose, have taken place in the unconscious over the millennia, even though such speculations have no firm foundation. Nevertheless, the possibility remains that the unconscious may reveal itself in an unexpected way at any time. The alchemical figure of the king has provoked this long discussion because it contains the whole of the hero myth, including the king's and God's renewal, and on the other hand, because, as we conjecture, it symbolizes the dominant that rules consciousness. King's soul is not a pleonasm. It denotes a consciousness which is not only conscious as such, but is conscious in quite a special way. It is controlled and directed by the dominant that in the last resort is the arbiter of values. The sun is the common light of nature, but the king, the dominant, introduces the human element and brings man nearer to the sun, or the sun nearer to man. Footnote 399. See the Solificatio in the Isis Mysteries. And a garland of flowers was upon my head, with white palm leaves sprouting out on every side like rays. Thus I was adorned like unto the sun, and made in the fashion of an image. The Golden Ass, translated by Adlington. This can absolutely signify something else. Consciousness is renewed through its descent into the unconscious, whereby the two are joined. The renewed consciousness does not contain the unconscious, but forms with it a totality symbolized by the sun. But since father and son are of one being, and in alchemical language, king's soul, representing the renewed consciousness, is the sun, consciousness would be absolutely identical with the king as dominant. For the alchemist, this difficulty did not exist, because the king was projected into a postulated substance, and hence behaved merely as an object to the consciousness of the artifacts. But if the projection is withdrawn by psychological criticism, we encounter the aforesaid difficulty that the renewed consciousness apparently coincides with the renewed king, or sun. I have discussed the psychological aspect of this problem in the second of the 2 essays on analytical psychology, in the chapter on the mana personality. The difficulty cannot be resolved by purely logical argument, but only by careful observation and analysis of the psychic state itself. Rather than launch out into a detailed discussion of case histories, I would prefer to recall the well-known words of Paul. I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. It is important to remember that Paul never met Christ. Christ as the concept of the Logos? Sure. Christ as the physical manifestation of the Logos? Abso-fucking-lutely not. Which aptly describes the peculiar nature of this state. From this, we can see that the other earlier state, when the king aged and disappeared, is marked by a consciousness in which the critical ego knowingly took the place of the sick king, looking back to an earlier mythical time, when this ego still felt absolutely dependent on a higher and mightier non-ego. The subsequent disappearance of the feeling of dependence and the simultaneous strengthening of criticism are felt as progress, enlightenment, liberation, indeed, as redemption. although a one-sided and limited being, has usurped the throne of a king. A personal ego seizes the reins of power to its own destruction. For mere egohood, despite possessing an anima rationalis, is not even sufficient for the guidance of personal life, let alone for the guidance of men. You need both ends of the pen, right? The other allegory that I gave for the pen, right? You making the conscious decisions on the conscious side, that is the voice that you hear when you decide to do. I am going to go do this thing. On the other side, in the unconscious, is the voice that tells you, hey, this is a good idea, or hey, this is a bad idea. Now, whether that voice is being truthful depends on whether you are feeding the positive or negative side of your unconscious. But that voice, when you do something wrong that tells you you shouldn't have done that, normally in the third person, that is the unconscious guiding you. It is giving you recommendations that your consciousness gets to make decisions about. The more you move down the pin, the more, like, this voice never goes away. You never get all the way into the unconscious. But you can become more conscious, and by becoming more conscious, you can make these decisions based upon this voice a lot easier. For this purpose, it always needs a mythical dominant, yet such a thing cannot simply be invented and then believed in. Contemplating our own times, we must say that though the need for an effective dominant was realized to a large extent, what was offered was nothing more than an arbitrary invention of the moment. The fact that it was also believed in goes to prove the gullibility and cluelessness of the public, and at the same time, the profoundly felt need for a spiritual authority transcending egohood. An authority of this kind is never the product of rational reflection or an invention of the moment, which always remains caught in a narrow circle of ego-bound consciousness. It springs from traditions whose roots go far deeper, both historically and psychologically. This is almost true, right? What I have, the understanding that I have, did have sources, right? But the understanding that I have does not comport with any of those sources. The understanding that I have did spring from traditions whose roots go far deeper. We have covered the playlists, right? The various tomes, the various understandings, all of that amalgamated through rational reflection led me to where I am. There is inspiration, divine, that ego, not the ego, the subconscious, the unconscious, talking to me in inspiration led to understanding. And so, in part this is true, in part it is not. There is rational reflection, that is part of the process. If it is not, then it is belief. And belief is a lot different than fact. Thus, a real and essentially religious renewal can be based, for us, only on Christianity. I absolutely, wholeheartedly, with all 10 toes and all 10 fingers, stand in opposition to that. That is pretty much the entirety of this channel, right? It didn't used to be. Before I did the Bible study, that was not true. But since I've done the Bible study, I stand against this, not against the individual people involved. Most of them have the best intentions, not all of them, but most of them. But the foundational understanding upon which is built is wrong, fundamentally flawed, with a severe misunderstanding of the entire source material. Once again, fall back to the Bible study. The extremely radical reformation of Hinduism by the Buddha assimilated the traditional spirituality of India in its entirety and did not thrust a rootless novelty upon the world. That can definitely be debated. The teachings of Buddha and the teachings of Hindu are not closely related. There are significant differences between them. It neither denied nor ignored the Hindu pantheon, swarming with millions of gods, but boldly introduced man, who before had not been represented at all. Nor did Christ, regarded simply as a Jewish reformer, destroy the law, but made it, rather, into a matter of conviction. That is kind of true if you take the words of Jesus, not if you take the doctrine that was built upon him. He likewise, as the regenerator of his age, set against the Greco-Roman pantheon and the speculations of the philosophers the figure of man, not intending it as a contradiction, but as the fulfillment of a mythologium that existed long before him, the conception of the Anthropos with its complex Egyptian, Persian, and Hellenistic background. Now, the Anthropos is making God into a human, and I am against that as well. Right? I quite often will interrupt with that. If you are casting human qualities upon God, that is an assertion that you are making with no foundational basis. There is no reason to believe that God has the physical incarnation of a human at all. There is no reason to believe that God is male or female at all. There are writings that lead you to believe that, but those writings are incorrect. They are not a full understanding, and most of them are not even a good understanding of the divine at all, including the ones from Egypt, Persia, and Hellenistic background, including Christianity and Judaism, including Hinduism and Buddhism. Zoroastrianism gets closest, in my estimation, and they still have some beliefs that are not right. Right? You don't have to walk around with certain clothing to be religiously observant. If you have to, then your religion is wrong. It is, however, where was it? A matter of conviction, right? This part, I believe, fully and firmly, totally outside of Christianity. Moral systems have existed outside of Christianity. You can see my video, What, If Not Jesus, What, God? You can see that one. Because there have been, in Hellenistic, pre-Hellenistic Greece, there was a moral system. In Native American cultures, there was a moral system. And all of those systems, right? Buddhism was a moralistic system. The beliefs in the steppes of Russia was a moralistic system. All of them completely exclusionary of Christianity altogether, and Judaism. Until Christianity, Judaism was basically unknown in the world. Right? It was a small, minor, regional inconvenience at best. It was not a wide-scoped, far-reaching thing, ever, in its entire history. And so, to base most of the beliefs that everybody came from that is ridiculous to me. Any renewal not deeply rooted in the best spiritual tradition is ephemeral. But the dominant that grows from historical roots acts like a living being within the ego-bound man. He does not possess it, it possesses him. Like, my moral order possesses me, right? And that is using possession not as an entity, right? It is the thing that drives me. It is the part that separates me from other people. It is that conviction we were just talking about. I can't watch TV because I find it absolutely disgusting. Everything that is on there is terrible to me. The news even lies to you. And it's like verifiably, empirically, provably true that it is a lie, right? There is no good entertainment out there that comes across the public airways. That is a conviction that is inside of me. It does not, I don't possess that. It possesses me. It is a physical turning of my body. When I see it and it is bad, my whole body revolts against it. That is a conviction, deeply rooted, but it's not in the spiritual tradition. You can go to church and you can still watch everything that comes on TV, no problems. You probably won't even be convicted about it. You'll make an excuse for it, right? That is a lesser understanding of the divine. And so the problem here is the problem with most of the control systems. Right? Even for the people who are leaving the control systems, it is difficult to separate yourself from the thing which you were brought up in. Jung was brought up a Catholic. Even in his disapproval of some of the things in the Catholic Church, he still sees them as a source. He still sees them as guidance, even though there's no real reason to look at the Catholic Church as a moral guide point at all. On top of that, he is still using the Bible as an authority, and there's no reason for that either. See the Bible study. It is contradictory to itself explicitly in the text, often with great effect upon the message. See the Bible study. The intrinsic problem is that if you were brought up thinking that this book is an authority, it is hard to separate yourself from that, except by thorough review, which most people do not do. See the Bible study. Therefore, the alchemist said that the artifact is not the master, but rather the minister of the stone, clearly showing that the stone is indeed a king, towards whom the artifact behaves as a subject. Now, my understanding is that the stone is your heart. That is the binder of the as above and the as below. It is the part that allows manifestation to happen. It is the part that literally transmutes the shitty things into the golden things. And so, for me, that is you having the stone, but not being the master of it, but rather the minister, the one that uses it, right? And so the stone is the king. That would be your heart. You should be led by your heart. For the most part, use your logic as well. Although the renewed king corresponds to a renewed consciousness, this consciousness is as different from its former state as the Filius Regis differs from the enfeebled old king. Just as the old king must forgo his power and make way for the little upstart ego, so the ego, when the renewed king returns, must step into the background. It still remains the sine qua non of consciousness. Footnote 400. Consciousness consists in the relation of a psychic content to the ego. Anything not associated with the ego remains unconscious of consciousness, but it no longer imagines that it can settle everything and do everything by the force of its will. It no longer asserts that where there is a will, there's a way. That is mostly not true, right? Where there is a will, there is a way. Almost exclusively. There are exceptions, however. There are bottlenecks, which are contracts, in my estimation, between souls, and sometimes those are terrible, right? And unavoidable. I have healed myself in 4 different ways. I outline them in this book. I healed a cyst, I healed my shoulder, I healed my back, I healed my leg. Those are physical results from this process that I stand upon. But there is still the possibility that I will contract some illness from which I am not able to heal myself. That would be a bottleneck. And it's not because I'm not asserting my conscious will, but it is because somebody else has a lesson to learn from that, right? If I am to die early, there's a lesson for me in whatever manner that death takes place. Sometimes the lessons are painful. That is true. But there is also a lesson for my wife in loss. There's a lesson for my children in loss. There is a lesson that comes from that we have all agreed to prior to incarnation. It's part of that amnesia effect. And so you have these bottlenecks already predetermined. For the most part, there is a small amount of adjustability if certain conditions are met, right? You can avoid some of them, but for most of them you cannot. This broken leg, my most recent one, was an unavoidable bottleneck. Now, there is the possibility that I could have avoided it if I would have taken different actions, right? But I didn't, and therefore the experience happened, and I have to either get bitter and resentful about what happened, or I can get golden and decide that I'm going to make gold out of the situation and find the lessons and achieve better consciousness, better understanding willfully of what could be contained in that situation. There are bottlenecks. So there are some things that you cannot avoid, but most of them you can. Almost everything in your life is due to a decision that you were making. If you are not achieving your goals, you're probably not executing upon them. If you are executing, that means that your plan is wrong. You missed something in your plan, right? There is something that you can do to change things. Even if you run across an obstacle, there are ways around them. You come upon a locked door. You can break the lock. You can pick the lock. You can remove the door. You can bust through the door. You can go through the wall, right? Maybe none of those are good options, but they are options. So you have the choice. And if you take away that choice, then you're taking away the point of the existence. Right? You get to choose. Your force of will is a force to be reckoned with. You get to manifest a lot of things in your life. Most of us are unintentionally, through the unconscious measures, manifesting the negative consequences. And then we say, well, there was nothing that can be done about it. Yes, there was. You just didn't do it. When lucky ideas come to it, it does not take credit for them, but begins to realize how dangerously close it had been to an inflation. The scope of its willing and doing becomes commensurate with reality again after an Ash Wednesday has descended upon its presumptuousness. Fucking Ash Wednesday. 401. This ever-repeated psychological situation is archetypal and expresses itself, for instance, in the relation of the Gnostic demiurge to the highest God. We can compare the logical sequence of psychological changes with the alchemical symbolism as follows. Oh boy, this is going to be difficult. All right. Ego-bound state with feeble dominant. The sick king, enfeebled by age, about to die. Ascent of the unconscious and or descent of the ego into the unconscious. The disappearance of the king in his mother's body, or his dissolution in water. Conflict and synthesis of conscious and unconscious. Pregnancy, sickbed symptoms, display of colors. Formation of a new dominant, circular symbols. An example, the mandala of the self. King's son, hermaphrodite, rotundum. Footnote 402. The conjunction symbolism appears in two places. First, at the descent into the darkness, when the marriage has a nefarious character, incest, murder, death. Second, before the ascent, when the union has a more heavenly character, with no examples. Though the comparison holds good on average, the symbolism of the Cantilena differs from the above schema in that the apotheosis of the Filius Regius takes place simultaneously with that of Queen Luna, thus paralleling the marriage in the apocalypse. The Christian prototype gained the upper hand in Ripley, whereas usually the conjunctio precedes the production of the lapis, and the latter is understood as the child of Sol and Luna, the lapis being the heart, Sol being the as above trinity, Luna being the as below. To that extent, the lapis exactly corresponds to the psychological idea of the self, the product of conscious and unconscious. In Christian symbolism, on the other hand, there is a marriage of the Lamb, the apocalyptic Christ, with the bride, Luna, Ecclesia. Because the lapis is itself androgynous, the synthesis of male and female, there is no need for another conjunctio. This symbolical androgyny of Christ does not, curiously enough, eliminate the marriage of the Lamb. The two things exist side by side. We have here a discrepancy between the alchemical psychological symbolism and the Christian. That is not all you have. It is indeed difficult to imagine what kind of conjunctio beyond the union of conscious, male, and unconscious, female, and the regenerated dominant could be meant, unless we assume with the dogmatic tradition that the regenerated dominant also brings the corpus mysticum of mankind, ecclesia as lunar, into glorious reality. There is something else, right? It is not too difficult to imagine, if it is pointed out to you, that the unity of the conscious and unconscious, or the male and the female, in the regenerated dominant, right, outside of dogmatic tradition, right, it brings the corpus mysticum to mankind in glorious reality. Among the alchemists, who were mostly solitaries by choice. That is not true. That is not true. I'm going to use myself as an example of this, right? And I've talked about it before. I'm on a solo mission, right? Most people are not going to comport with me. I say all of the time that this channel is open for everyone, but it is not for everyone. And that is because of this. It's not that I don't desire interaction. It's not that I don't desire discussion or the challenging of ideas or companionship even. But there is a tendency to use those outdated resources such as the Bible, right? And I just can't deal with that, right? If you are stuck that this book is the truth, that's fine. Do you, boo, right? I'm not going to argue with you. I could do that on this channel much more aggressively than I do. It may not seem that way because this is what's brought to light by the text, but I could very well be doing reaction videos to Wes Huff and completely shitting on him, right? That would be more antagonistic. That's not something I'm interested in. I am here for bringing about knowledge. This is a good way to do that, and it is less antagonistic because when it comes up, it comes up. It's not me seeking the argument. The argument just happens to pop up. It's not that I don't want the companionship. It's just that there are no suitable companions. And yes, I understand there are a few. I see you, Jason. Right? But for the most part, it's not. For the most part, people don't want what I have. And it is because they don't understand it. Right? I am on a narrow path, and it seems very restrictive. It seems like a difficult path to walk, but it's not. Right? I don't drink because I don't care for it. That not caring for it was part of the spiritual transformation process. It's not that I can't enjoy alcohol. It's just for the most part I don't. It's not that I can't watch sports. It's just that I find them completely inane. It's not that I can't discuss what happened on TV. It's just that I don't want to. And because I don't want to, I am hard to be around. It's hard to have deep conversations all of the time. But that is what is coming if you are around me. We're not going to be talking about some light, fluffy type of shit. We're going to be talking about the deep, dark shit, right? We're going to be talking about the practical application of the things that I deal with, because that is intrinsically central to my life. The things that I talk about over here, I practice. Right? I don't just say things because they are things that sound good. I say things because I have put them into practical application in my life, and it has brought about significant benefits. But those things are restrictive. I'm not allowed to go out and have sex with anyone but my wife. I'm not allowed to go out and get pissed drunk every night. I'm not allowed to dismiss my responsibilities. I don't call, like if I was working, I would call into work, right? The amount of responsibility that is upon me now on this path is greater than it ever has been in my entire life. I have no anxiety about it. I'm not depressed about it. I'm not worried in the slightest bit about the path. Now, I'm worried, am I executing the path correctly? Am I taking the steps so that I can spread this correctly? That's where my anxiety resides, not if I'm making the correct choices. This path is mostly solitary because most people are not willing to walk it. And it's not that they were solitary by choice. But back then, in 1400, what happened in the 1400s? Do you know? I'm going to tell you. You put it in the box if you get it before me. The Inquisition. What would have happened if the things that I talk about in here, the intrinsic balancing of yourself through the use of the electromagnetic forces of creation, what would have happened during the Inquisition to me? I would have at best been tied to a stake and lit on fire. Probably put into some torturous devices because I would not have admitted that I was doing wrong. I would not have said, I worship the devil, because I don't. I don't believe in him. I don't believe that the devil is a real thing. I believe that there is a voice of temptation. That is not the co-equal to God, right? Well, it kind of is. There is the voice that you listen to, right? It can be either positive or negative. That positive voice, that's God telling you, hey, you should do this thing. Then the negative voice that is telling you to do the bad thing, that's the same voice. You're just feeding the wrong end of it. And so, all of that to say that it's not that I want to be alone. It's not that they wanted to be alone. It's just that if you were on this path, you kind of have to be. And not only that, like, you have to be okay with it. Like, you have to get to the point where you're like, okay, everybody else believes this other thing. Now, I don't at all. And if I stand alone, so stand I. That's where you have to be. And so it was not a choice. Who were mostly solitaries by choice, the motif of the apocalyptic marriage, characterized as the marriage of the Lamb, is missing. The accent here lying on the sacrificial appellation, Lamb. According to the oldest and most primitive tradition, the king, despite his dignity and power, was a victim, offered up for the prosperity of his country and his people. And in his godlike form, he was even eaten. As we know, this archetype underwent an extremely complicated development in Christianity. From the standpoint of Christian symbolism, the alchemist's conception of the goal lacked, firstly, the motif of the heavenly marriage, and secondly, the almost more important motif of sacrifice and the totem meal. I would agree that this is indeed the most important thing in the religious control system that is Christian symbolism, because this foundational concept of the sacrifice and the totem meal is victim mentality. It is 100% placing upon someone else the thing that you should be taking responsibility for yourself. This is listening to the wrong voice. It may lead to a good place. Oftentimes it does, right? Getting involved in the church, for the most part, is good for most people, right? I am the exception. I read the book. But for the church, the most important part of it is not the heavenly marriage. The most important, the first most important part in the control system is the control. And the control comes from explicitly that someone else died for your sin and that you are not responsible for them. That is victim mentality writ large. The Mourne gods of Asia Minor, Tammuz, Adonis, etc. were all, in all probability, originally sacrifices for the fruitfulness of the year. The lapis was decidedly an ideal for hermits, a goal for isolated individuals. Besides that, it was a food, cibus immortalis, could be multiplied indefinitely, was a living being with a body, soul, and spirit, an androgyne with incorruptible body, etc. Though likened to King Soul and even named such, it was not a sponsus, not a victim, and belonged to no community. It was like the treasure hidden in a field, the which when a man hath found, he hideth, or like one pearl of great price, for which a man went and sold all that he had and bought it. It was the well-guarded precious secret of the individual. Footnote 403. See the Oxyrhynchios fragment 5. Jesus saith, wherever there are two, there are not without God, and wherever there is one alone, I say, I am with him. Raise the stone, and there thou shalt find me. Cleave the wood, and there I am. This is from Grenfell and Hunt's New Sayings of Jesus. I'm fairly positive that this was just before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Right now, I do believe that it is a treasure. I don't believe that it should be hidden, but it is understandable why it was hidden, because it was of danger to you to be where I am in the control systems of the time. Right? One pearl of great price, I will even make that argument. I am casting my pearls. And you should sell all that you have to buy it. I have firmly and fully believe that if this were the common practice, we would be a lot closer to the kingdom. It was the well-guarded, precious secret of the individual. And though the old masters emphasized that they would not hide their secret jealously, 404, particularly in the turba, and would reveal it to all seekers, it was perfectly clear that the stone remained the preoccupation of the individual. That is because it is an intrinsically internal thing. The seeking of the external philosopher's stone was based upon the fact that you have the internal one. In this connection, it should not be forgotten that in antiquity, certain influences, evidently deriving from the Gnostic doctrine of the hermaphroditic primordial man, that is not Gnostic, right? The primordial hermaphrodite extends to Hinduism, which predates at least most of the Gnostic traditions. Again, I am going to point out that saying Gnostic traditions is like saying Christianity, right? The ways that it is applied. Some of the Gnostic sects were sex cults. Some of them completely abstained from sex. That is, two completely diametrically opposed viewpoints on how to execute. They're both listed as Gnostic. Gnostic simply means that it was a post-Hellenistic understanding. For the most part, there were some pre-Hellenistic in opposition to the understanding of Christ. That is what it really means, right? There was, I believe, one of those sects that was literally named Gnostic. The rest of them are attributed simply because they didn't comport with the church. And they were all lumped together. Although there is no reason to do that. That is like saying Catholics, Baptists, and Episcopalians are all the exact, or Pentecostals. That's even better than Episcopalians, right? That is saying that is the exact same religion. It is not at all, right? The Catholics believe that you can just sprinkle a little bit of water on a baby and they're saved forever. The Baptists believe that you have to take that decision upon yourself and be immersed in water. The Pentecostals, it pretty much needs to be moving water. And you have to have the evidence of tongues, right? That is three completely different ways of looking at the exact same thing, Christianity. That is the same problem with labeling Gnostics. There was a wide variety of people with many very varied beliefs across thousands of years, many of them predating Christ. The hermaphroditic primordial man. And again, that is, you can find that in the Hindu beliefs, right? Which predated all of them. It is entirely likely that Hinduism was one of the primary religions for the area. The hermaphroditic primordial man penetrated into Christianity and there gave rise to the view that Adam had been created an androgyne. Footnote 406. As late as Bohm, Adam was described as a male virgin. See the problems? Fucking three principles of the divine essence. Such views had been attacked by Augustine. God created, like according to the Bible, which I do not hold as the source, but if you're going to quote the source, you should quote it correctly, right? According to the Bible, God created man, and he was good. But then man was dissatisfied, and so he created him a companion in the exact same way that all of the animals had a companion, which means that they were having sex. Right? That was the reason for the companionship. They didn't know right from wrong. They didn't know good from evil. They weren't having some deep philosophical discussions. Right? They were copulating. To cast in any way, shape, or form whatsoever after Eve that Adam was a virgin is just simply trying to read something that is not there. Right? There's a lot of problems in Genesis. A lot. That Adam was a virgin is a brand new one to me. And since Adam was a prototype of Christ and Eve sprung from his side, that of the church, it is understandable that a picture of Christ should develop showing distinctly feminine features. I don't know that that's understandable. 407. See the picture of his baptism in the Renewal Codex, reproduced in Goldschmidt. Again, here's another thing, right? Using religious iconography from, at the best, centuries after the death of the person that is being displayed is entirely dependent upon the imagination of the artist. It does not have a direct correlation with reality at all. See why Jesus. In religious art, the Christ image has retained this character to the present day. Footnote 408. How different is the picture of the Holy Shroud in Turin? Its veiled androgyny reveals the hermaphroditism of the lapis, which in this respect has more affinity with the views of the Gnostics. In recent times, the theme of androgyny has been subjected to quite special treatment in a book by a Catholic writer which merits our attention. This is Diagnosis de Christianums by George Kopkin, an important work that appeared in 1939. Okay, so this is after World War II. I thought this was in the 20s. This is obviously in the 40s, which would explain why he's making reference to the current situations. With the Episcopal imprimatur in Salzburg, and this since then has been placed in the index. Of the Apollonian Dawsonian conflict in antiquity, Kopkin says it found its solution in Christianity because in the person of Jesus, the male is united with the female. Really? Only in him do we find this juxtaposition of male and female in unbroken unity. If men and women can come together as equals in Christian worship, this has more than an accidental significance. It is the fulfillment of the androgyny that was made manifest in Christ. It is important to note that in the beginnings of Christianity, the sexes were separated. The change of sex in the believer is suggested in Revelation 14:4. These are they that were not defiled with women, for they are virgins. And that is one of the intrinsic flaws in the book. Right? God created you with sexual organs. He fully intended for you to take advantage of those. Not with everyone, but in sacred union. If you use the Bible as a reference, you cannot, under any circumstances, come to the conclusion that God did not want you to have sex. You cannot come to that conclusion at all. You were given very explicit commands in the beginning to go forth, procreate, multiply, subdue the earth, be a steward thereof, shed no blood of man. By the way, now you can eat meat. Go look that up. For they are virgins. Right? This is reading some shit in there that you want to be true, but is not necessarily true. And we are not going to get into the whole conspiracy that maybe the apostles like to suck on a penis. We won't get into that. Kopkin says of this passage, here the new androgynous form of existence becomes visible. Christianity is neither male nor female. It is male-female in the sense that the male paired with the female in Jesus' soul. Oh, so they were fucking in Jesus. They just wasn't fucking Jesus. Well, I just set somebody off with that. Oh well, you'll get over it. In Jesus, the tension and polarization, like, here, let's go ahead and fully piss you off. If that pisses you off, I'm about to really get you. There is no conceivable way, knowing Jewish tradition, right? Knowing what was common in Judaism as a whole, with no exceptions. There is no way that you can consider that Jesus would be a teacher of the Torah and not having sex. It is possible that he was joined in a sacred union and lost his spouse and then went on his missions. That is possible. It is not possible that he was ever an unmarried man and anyone in the Jewish community listened to him at all, especially in his 30s. Generally speaking, by the time you were 15, you were married as a Jew, almost with no exceptions, even in the priesthood. In addition to that, in order to get access to the higher teachings of the Torah, You had to be married and over the age of 30. Those things are facts. There is no conceivable way that an unmarried 30-year-old virgin was going about Israel teaching anyone anything. There is simply no way that that is possible. And I don't even couch that in speculation. And so for me, all of this is beyond ridiculous. In Jesus, the tension and polaristic strife of sex are resolved in an androgynous unity. Right? That is this. That is this. The masculine and the feminine joined together through the heart into the divine. And the church, as his heir, has taken over from him. She too is androgynous. It's funny that you refer to the church as a she. Right? I get the allegory of the bride of Christ, right? But it is extremely funny. We were just, like I said, that in the beginning of Christianity, the separation of the sexes, that still continues today. Right? If you were unaware, you cannot be a female and be a head of the church in Catholicism. Simply can't do it. You can't do that for most of the Protestant sects. There's a few that you can be a female and be a pastor in, but it is not most of them by a long shot. Right? You cannot, I'm pretty sure you can't be a Baptist. I know you cannot be a Pentecostal. I'm pretty sure that you can't be I think Presbyterian went that way, and maybe Episcopalian, but most of the other ones, no, absolutely not. And so it is funny, very funny, these references to equality and balance and androgyny. And then to call her androgynous when there's no her involved in any of the application is funny to me. As regards her constitution, the church is hierarchically masculine, yet her soul is thoroughly feminine. So in your estimation, the soul of the church is completely unconscious? Without direction? Without conscious decision? Without logic being applied at all? I guess that can work. The virgin priest fulfills in his soul the androgynous unity of male and female. You know why priests are required to be virgins? Right? They fail. They fail. Right? If you were unaware, there are many problems with that particular situation. You know why that came about, though? So that the church could keep its property. That is why they were restricted from getting married. That wasn't always the case. There was a time when it was perfectly acceptable to be married as a Catholic priest. And then the church started losing assets, and they did not like that at all because they're not all that charitable. They do charity. I'm not taking away from that. But the charity that they do, in contrast with the wealth that they hold, is demonstrable of their understanding of God. We will put it that way. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go take a virtual tour of the Vatican. Just go and look virtually at the wealth that they display, and then look at the extreme poverty that they are surrounded in. And I'm not saying that just throwing money at a situation will take care of it. There are a lot of people who believe that you can get rid of homelessness by giving people homes. That is stupid. That doesn't work. But there are opportunities that you can create in various places that are affected by severe poverty if you had the resources, right? One of my goals on this channel is to develop the resources to be able to do that. I want to invest my own money into an effort like that. That may mean that I create my school, which is what I want to do, create a school to teach people how to do life. It might be that I start a community somewheres, not as a figurehead or a leader type situation, but simply because I will take the action, and then surround myself with people who are in the same thing, right? It's not about the corporeality. You should be able to invest whatever you get in a way that is effective for the people. The church has done that in opposite, right? They have invested in charitable works which align with their mission, and only which align with their mission. If it does not have the result of producing people for the church, they're not interested in helping at all. That is a fundamental problem with that particular control system. The virgin priest. And like that was law or something. Right? It was hundreds of years where they were able to have no problems. It was not until they began losing their assets that they decided to address that situation. And it could have been addressed in a different way. He renders visible again the psychic dimension which Christ showed us for the first time when he revealed the manly virginity of his soul. Footnote 409. Kobgen notes, not even the reformers who twisted the ideal of virginity in the interest of a bourgeois ethos, bourgeois you say, ventured to change anything in this respect. Even for them, Christ was an androgynous unity of man and virgin. The only puzzling thing is that they acknowledge the virginity of Christ while disapproving the virginity of priesthood. Both of them are equally bad. For Kobgen, therefore, not only Christ is androgynous, but the church as well. A remarkable conclusion, the logic of which one cannot deny. The consequence of this is a special emphasis on bisexuality, and then on the peculiar identity of the church with Christ, which is based also on the doctrine of the Corpus Mysticum. Well, that would explain a lot, right? Now, remember I told you before that they failed, right? They were supposed to be pre-devout virgins, and they fail. There's a lot of nuns that come up pregnant. A lot. There are a lot of children that come up molested. A lot. Both of those situations takes away the virginity of those priests. And this, with the special emphasis on bisexuality, that would absolutely make sense for a lot of those things. This certainly forestalls the marriage of the Lamb at the end of time, for the androgyne has everything it needs. Footnote 410. Senior, in need of nothing, as an attribute of the Valentinian monad. The Valentinian monad, you say. Alright. At the end of time, even. And is already a complexio oppositorium. Who is not reminded here of the fragment from the Gospel according to the Egyptians, cited by the Clement of Alexandria. When ye have trampled on the garment of shame, and when the two become one in the male with the female is neither male nor female. Footnote 411. I don't know the source material. So. Stromata cited in James, the apocryphal New Testament. Kobgen introduces his book with a dedication and a motto. The first is Renatus Predestinati, to those who are reborn out of the predestination. And the second is from John 14:12. He that believeth on me, the works that I do, he shall do also, and greater works than these shall he do. The dedication echoes the motif of election, which the author shares with the alchemist. For Marinius had said of alchemy. Before we get into that, I want to point out something. This right here, from John 14:12, he that believeth on me, the works that I do, he shall do also, and greater works than these shall he do, is something that has not proven to be a thing. We have just over 2,000 years now, right? Or, well, not quite, right? It was 2033 will make 2,000 years since the death of Christ, and the understanding that most people have. Where is the fruit? Where is the miracles? Where is the growth? Where is the healing? Where is it? It was said that if you believe on me, not in God, but on Christ, if you believe on me, not in action, but simply believe, that you will be able to do these things. Where is it? Where is it? We have had a few examples of people who have exhibited some miracles. That is true. We don't know whether that was based upon this or not. That is true. What we do have is a dearth. A dearth means a lack of. We have a dearth of miracles, right? That is not to count away miracles that happen every day, right? Somebody gets in a car wreck and a woman is able to free her child by picking up a car, right? That is a miracle. That happens a lot, right? That is a thing that does happen. But that is not intentionality in healing. That is not intentionality in producing the fruit. I say this with as much humility as I possibly can because I have done something, and that leads to a little bit of pride, right? I try to couch that. I try to understand that and to make sure that I express. It is through the use of the Holy Spirit, which is given unto everyone. It is through the use of the Holy Spirit and the balancing of myself by doing the things that I talk about in these videos. I have been able to heal myself in 4 ways: throat, shoulder, back, and knee. Those are real, right? Maybe the medical science will never believe it. I don't care. I don't give 2 rats' asses. Doesn't make a single flying fuck at a rolling donut for me. I have produced the results within myself of the things that I talk about. And so, thus shall he do. But it is not through belief of Christ. It is through the belief in God. It is through the assimilation of the as above and the as below. It is through the balancing of the things that God has given me. And so, I'm not a virgin by a long shot. I'm in sacred union these days. I don't go outside. I'm not interested in that. I try to comport myself in balance for all of the virtues and vices. I fail. I am not perfect. I don't claim to be perfect. I claim to try to set myself as perfect. I set my goal at perfect, knowing full well that I will never achieve it. But it is still my goal. I still strive for it. I am not perfect. I don't believe in Christ. And yet I have healed myself. That should tell you something. God vouchsafes this divine and pure science to his faithful and his servants, that is, on those whom nature made it proper to confer it from the beginning of things. For this thing cannot else but the gift of God Most High, who commits and shows it as he will, and to whom he will of his faithful servants. Hi, how you doing? I'm Pitt. For the Lord selects his servants, those whom he wills and chooses, and to seek after this divine science, which is concealed from man, and having sought it, to keep it with him. Now, one of the things that I am doing is not keeping it with me, right? I am giving it away, but I feel like that is at the direction of the divine. Footnote 412. The transmute metallica. This seemingly pointless and selfish procedure becomes understandable if the alchemical opus is regarded as a divine mystery. In that case, its mere presence in the world would be sufficient. Dorn says much the same. For it sometimes comes about after many years, many labors, much study, that some are chosen, when much knocking, many prayers, and diligent inquiry have gone before. Footnote 413 and 414. 413. For the first chief of the Spagyrics saith, Knock, and it shall be open unto you. The chief of the Spagyrics, you say? I am unfamiliar with this translation of Matthew 7:7. That is in Physicus Trismegistus, so from the Theatrica Chemicum, so maybe it is something completely different, but knock and it shall be opened is definitely one of those things that I talk about. Seek and you shall find. That was this. When I found God underneath the oak tree in front of the church, right, on a random day, when I found God, I was seeking. I was knocking. I was searching. And I got answers. But those answers were dependent upon me. Like, I took an oath that day, right? My whole world had fallen apart. Everything that I had ever had was gone. My last remnant of hope, right? My trailer, when I found that God that day, my trailer was laying almost on its side. The guy that was supposed to move it had wrecked the trailer, right? And I'm talking about a house trailer, not just like a car trailer. I was despondent and I went searching. And one of the things in the process was that I told God that I would follow him wherever it might lead and whatever the consequences might be. That was me searching, that was me seeking, that was me knocking, and it has been opened. I have results from that. So, knocking it shall be opened for you is one of those things that I say. The quotation from John is taken from the 14th chapter, where Christ teaches that whoever sees him sees the Father. He is in the Father, and the Father is in him. Once again, pointing you to the Father. The disciples are in him, and he in them. Moreover, they will be sent the Holy Ghost as Paraclete, and will do works that are greater than his own. This 14th chapter broaches a question that was to have great repercussions for the future. The problem of the Holy Ghost, who will remain when Christ is gone, and who intensifies the interpenetration of the divine and the human to such a degree that we can properly speak of a Christification of the disciples. Among the Christian mystics, this identity was carried again and again to the point of stigmatization. Only the mystics bring creativity into religion. That is probably why they can feel the presence and the workings of the Holy Ghost, and why they are nearer to the experience of brotherhood in Christ. Kobjan thinks along the same lines, as his dedication and motto show. It is easy to see what happens when the logical conclusion is drawn from the 14th chapter of John. The opus Christi is transferred to the individual. He then becomes the bearer of the mystery, and this development was unconsciously prefigured and anticipated in alchemy, which showed clear signs of becoming a religion of the Holy Ghost and of the Sapientia Dei. Kobjan's standpoint is that of creative mysticism, which has always been critical of the Church, though this is not obviously so in Kobjan. His attitude betrays itself indirectly in the living content of his book, which consistently presses for a deepening and broadening of the dogmatic ideas. Because he remained fully conscious of his conclusions, he does not stray so very far outside the Church, whereas the alchemists, because of their unconsciousness and naive lack of reflection, and unhampered by intellectual responsibility, went much further in their symbolism. That is not the reasoning, but the point of departure for both is the procreative, revelatory working of the Holy Ghost, who is a wind that bloweth where it listeth, and who advances beyond his own workings to greater works than these. The creative mystic was ever a cross for the Church, but it is to him that we owe what is best in humanity. Footnote 415, and that will bring us out. I can only agree with Aldous Huxley when he writes in Grey Eminence, by the end of the 17th century, mysticism has lost its old significance in Christianity and is more than half dead. Well, what of it, may be asked. Why shouldn't it die? What use is it when it's alive? The answer to these questions is that where there is no vision, the people perish, and that if those who are the salt of the earth lose their savor, there is nothing to keep that earth disinfected, nothing to prevent it from falling into complete decay. The mystics are channels through which a little knowledge of reality filters down into our human universe of ignorance and illusion. A totally unmystical world would be a world totally blind and insane. In a world inhabited by what the theologians call unregenerate or unnatural men, church and state can probably never become appreciably better than the best of the states and churches, of which the past has left us a record. Society can never be greatly improved until such a time as most of its members choose to become theocentric saints. I don't disagree. Meanwhile, a few theocentric saints who exist at any given moment are able in some slight measure to qualify and mitigate the poisons which society generates within itself by its political and economic activities. In the gospel phrase, theocentric saints are the salt which preserves the social world from breaking down into irremediable decay. Theocentric just means centered upon God, and I am not in opposition to that. That is going to bring us to the end of Part 8. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment, not too much confusion, to a series of somewhat difficult topics. I understand I hold some unconventional beliefs, and I do have a tendency to step on toes when I relay those. It is not intentional, but it is not something that I apologize for. Once again, I don't have a whole lot to add. These studies have been long because I'm trying to be as inclusive along the way, so I don't have a whole lot to add at the wrap-up. So if you like what I'm doing over here, let me know down below. Give me a like, a share, or follow. Throw me a comment. Whether you agree or disagree with anything that was stated, put it in the box down below, and if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. If you really like what I'm doing over here, hit me with that super thanks. Consider joining for a membership, picking up a copy of my book where I teach you all of these things in practical application, or contacting me directly for a consultation. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you were here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been pittstake. Peace.